hearing the findings of the January 6th investigation, the House Select Committee that's been investigating for nearly a year now. The American people not only watching images, film that had not been seen in this country before now, just moments ago, but also listening to a roadmap, if you will, from both the chairman and the vice chair, Liz Cheney, on where they plan to go in these half-dozen hearings or so over the course of this month. I want to bring in Jonathan Karl, our chief Washington correspondent, because, John, you have been reporting for some time now, and you and I were talking about this on the news earlier tonight. You see all of our team standing by here. But, John, one of the biggest challenges for this committee is to try to link events, sort of series of events that might have led up to what we saw transpire on January 6th in this country. They spoke of Attorney General Bill Barr, who said there was no basis, no widespread fraud that would overturn the results of this election. But then they went to immediate planning that took place, they believe, according to their findings, outside of the Justice Department, when he hit roadblocks with the Justice Department, these meetings that the president was involved with. And they talked in particular about one meeting in December at the Oval Office. It was just the president, Rudy Giuliani, a couple of others, until the lawyers learned that he was having this meeting, and then they went right into that meeting to try to sort of intercept, if you will, what was playing out.
David, the aim of this committee is to tie those searing images we just watched of that violence, that horrible attack on the U.S. Capitol, into a larger effort by Donald Trump to overturn the election. And that meeting you mentioned, which December 18th, perhaps the strangest meeting that has ever happened in the Oval Office, included Donald Trump, Sidney Powell, Michael Flynn, his former national security advisor, who just days earlier on television had called for martial law, suggested there should be martial law to force a rerunning of the election in the states that Donald Trump lost. And the committee, Liz Cheney, talked about that meeting and how just hours after the meeting was over, he put out a tweet calling on his supporters to come to Washington on January 6th, concluding it will be wild. So that's the point here. The point is, it's not just a riot on the Capitol. It's not just a protest that went bad. This was something that was a direct cause, was directly caused by Donald Trump's actions in the weeks and months before January 6th. That is what this committee is trying to establish.
In fact, John, Congresswoman Cheney said over the course of these hearings, they're now going to point out the coordination and the planning that then followed that particular tweet saying, be here on January 6th, it will be wild. She mentioned the Proud Boys and said there was coordination among them and many others after that tweet, after that meeting in the Oval Office.
There was planning on several levels. Part of the planning was for the rally that the president gave in the ellipse outside of the White House on January 6th, where he gave that speech telling his supporters not to be weak, saying that they would lose their country. That level of planning. There was also the level of planning of the groups that were staunchly supporting Donald Trump and would do anything for him, including those militant groups. The Proud Boys, also the Oath Keepers, they're planning for January 6th to be there and to be in force as it was the very last opportunity to stop Joe Biden from being officially certified as the next president of the United States.
And, John, you've reported extensively on the relationship between the former president and his vice president, Mike Pence, and you reported on this key point. But Liz Cheney went further here in this first primetime hearing. She said in describing the testimony that they've received about people who were in the West Wing as all this was unfolding on January 6th, that you will hear that President Trump was yelling, angry at advisors who told him something needed to be done, something more. And when the president was aware of the rioters' chants to hang Mike Pence, Liz Cheney said the president responded with this sentiment, quote, maybe our supporters have the right idea. Mike Pence, quote, deserves it.
I'll tell you, that was such an extraordinary revelation, really mind-blowing in a way, David, but it was not surprising to me. When I interviewed Donald Trump last year, just a month and a half after he left the White House, and I asked him about those chants about Mike Pence, he told me that it was common sense. When I said they were chanting Mike Pence, he said, well, they were angry. It's common sense. How could you pass on a fraudulent vote? He did not condemn never to this moment has never condemned those chances of hanging Mike Pence. And back when I spoke to him over a year ago, he was justifying those chances of hanging Mike Pence. And now we hear tonight that he was actually suggesting in real time in the Oval Office that Mike Pence deserved that. Think about that. He's talking about people calling for the execution of his loyal vice president. And he's justifying that call.
Yeah, extraordinarily loyal vice president. And we heard Mark Short, who worked in the vice president's office, talking about how loyal he was, in fact, to the president for so many years, Mike Pence, that he was proud of what the administration had accomplished, but that his fidelity to the Constitution in the end was greater than his loyalty to President Trump. I want to bring in our Chief Global Affairs Correspondent and anchor Martha Raddatz, co-anchor of This Week. And Martha, something that struck me, and I'm sure it struck you as well, that in the what they've presented so far, at least, in describing the hours that were unfolding on January 6th, the president watching from that room off the Oval Office, advisors are urging him to do something, that we heard from the chair of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, who talked about the Defense Department never getting the call from President Trump to defend the Capitol.
Exactly, David. The President Trump is watching what's happening on Capitol Hill. He's watching this assault on the Capitol. He doesn't call the Secretary of Defense. He doesn't call the Department of Homeland Security. He doesn't call the Attorney General. It was Mike Pence who was calling Mark Milley, who was calling the Pentagon. And Mark Milley said he remembers that call. 2 or 3 calls, he believes, he got that day from Mike Pence to the Pentagon, to the Secretary of Defense, saying, get the military up there. Get the National Guard up there immediately. Milley said he was animated and explicit. And compare that to what Mark Milley said about Mark Meadows, the Chief of Staff to Donald Trump. He said Mark Meadows was saying, we have to change the narrative. We have to change the narrative. We can't let people think Mike Pence is in charge. And for Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who took an oath to the Constitution, that said, politics, 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 no action, merely politics. And for General Milley, he said that was a red flag. David?
Yeah, a red flag. He saw it as politics, Martha, but he was not going to buy this argument or this pressure that General Milley was now hearing on that phone call, that exchange with Mr. Meadows, the former chief of staff to President Trump, who was saying we can't have this narrative, as you point out. This was something we learned tonight, that they were saying in the West Wing, that we can't have this narrative that Mike Pence is trying to protect the Capitol and not the president.
Exactly, David, and Mark Milley would not have it. He wanted to stay away from politics. If you will recall, he walked across Lafayette Square with President Trump. He regretted that. He apologized for that later. He was not in that photo opportunity, but for him, he kept reminding people, especially the military, stay out of politics.
Martha Raddatz with us tonight. She'll be here all night long with us. Martha, stand by here. I do want to bring in Rachel Scott, who is our congressional correspondent. And Rachel, we know in this country, particularly in these polarized times, everything gets politicized. This included this investigation, as we know. We also know, though, in the hours after January 6th, we saw it on the Senate floor, we saw it in the House, from leading Republicans, not only holding the president accountable, but saying that we did need to investigate, that this country needed to get to the root of how this could possibly happen. And you heard that warning from the Vice Chair Liz Cheney today to fellow Republicans that one day after a Donald Trump goes away, your dishonor will not.
Yeah, that strong warning from Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who sent that message to Republicans who she says are defending the indefensible, reminding them that they took an oath to the country, not a political party. This hearing is coming at a moment where the Republican Party is trying to figure out its future. And the days, the weeks, the months since the January 6th insurrection, this is a party that in many ways has grown a lot closer to the former president, David.
As we prepare to listen to the chairman, Benny Thompson, again, we await the first witnesses in this first primetime hearing. I should mention that Donna Brazil, Democratic strategist, ABC News consultant, Governor Chris Christie, obviously Republican governor, both standing by to weigh in with what they're making of what's transpired already in this first primetime hearing. Let's listen to the chairman.
The committee will be in order. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us this evening to share their firsthand accounts of that terrible day. I know that some of the witnesses from our first hearing are in the room with us, along with some of the family members, friends, and widows of the officers who lost their lives as a result of the attack. Thank you all for being here for us and the American people. Officer Carolyn Edwards has been with the United States Capitol Police since 2017. On January 6th, Officer Edwards was assigned to the First Responder Unit, which serves as the first line of defense at the Capitol complex. She also served as a member of the Civil Disturbance Unit, a special subset of the uniformed division trained to respond to mass demonstration events. Officer Edwards is a graduate of the University of Georgia and currently is working on a master's degree in intelligence analysis from Johns Hopkins University. Nick Quisted is an acclaimed filmmaker whose credits include documenting stories from war zones in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. On January 6th, Mr. Quickstead was working on a documentary about, quote, why Americans are so divided when Americans have so much in common, end quote. During that day, Mr. Quickstead interviewed and documented movements of the people around the Capitol, including the first moments of the violence against the Capitol Police and the chaos that ensued. I will now swear in our witnesses. The witnesses will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear and affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Without objection, the witness's statement will be included in the record. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I recognize myself for questioning. As you saw just a few minutes ago, the Proud Boys instigated the first breach of the Capitol just before 1:00 p.m., where rioters pushed over barricades near the Peace Circle at the foot of the Capitol. Our two witnesses tonight were both there at the time of that first breach. Officer Edwards was standing with other officers behind a line of bike racks that marked the perimeter of the Capitol grounds. She bravely tried to prevent an angry crowd from advancing on the Capitol. Unfortunately, she was overrun and knocked unconscious as the crowd advanced on the Capitol. Mr. Quickstead was a few yards away from Officer Edwards, taking footage of the Proud Boys as part of his work on a documentary film. Most of his footage has never been shown publicly before we shared it this evening. Officer Edwards, I'd like to start by asking if you could tell us why you believe it's important for you to share your story this evening with the committee and the American public. Please, your microphone.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it, and thank you to the committee for having me here to testify. I was called a lot of things on January 6, 2021 and the days thereafter. I was called Nancy Pelosi's dog, called incompetent, called a hero, and a villain. I was called a traitor to my country, my oath, and my Constitution. In actuality, I was none of those things. I was an American, standing face to face with other Americans, asking myself how many times, many times, how we had gotten here. I had been called names before, but never had my patriotism or duty been called into question. I, who got up every day, no matter how early the hour or how late I got in the night before, to put on my uniform and to protect America's symbol of democracy. I, who spent countless hours in the baking sun and freezing snow to make sure that America's elected officials were able to do their job. I, whose literal blood, sweat, and tears were shed that day defending the building that I spent countless holidays and weekends working in. I am the proud granddaughter of a Marine that fought in the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in the Korean War. I think of my papa often in these days, how he was so young and thrown into a battle he never saw coming and answered the call at a great personal cost. How he lived the rest of his days with bullets and shrapnel in his legs, but never once complained about his sacrifice. I would like to think that he would be proud of me, proud of his granddaughter that stood her ground that day and continued fighting, even though she was wounded, like he did many years ago. I am my grandfather's granddaughter, proud to put on a uniform and serve my country. They dared to question my honor. They dared to question my loyalty. And they dared to question my duty. I am a proud American, and I will gladly sacrifice everything to make sure that the America my grandfather defended is here for many years to come. Thank you.
Officer Edwards, your story and your service is important, and I thank you for being here tonight. Ms. Quickstead, I also like to ask you to introduce yourself. Can you tell us how you found yourself in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, 2021?
Good evening, Chair and Madam Vice Chair. Thank you for the introduction. As stated, in the winter of 2020, I was working on a documentary. As part of that documentary, I filmed several rallies in Washington, D.C. on December the 11th and December the 12th. And I learned there would be a rally on the Mall on January 6th. So my 3 colleagues and I came down to document the rally. According to the permit of the event, there was going to be a rally at the Ellipse. We arrived at the Mall and observed a large contingent of Proud Boys marching towards the Capitol. We filmed them, and almost immediately I was separated from my colleagues. I documented the crowd turn from protesters to rioters to insurrectionists. I was surprised at the size of the group, the anger and the profanity. And for anyone who didn't understand how violent that event was, I saw it, I documented it, and I experienced it. I heard incredibly aggressive chanting, and I subsequently shared that footage with the authorities. I'm here today pursuant to a House subpoena. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Quested. The Select Committee has conducted extensive investigative work to understand what led the Proud Boys and other rioters to the Capitol on January 6th. We've obtained substantial evidence showing that the president's December 19th tweet calling his followers to Washington, D.C. on January 6th energized individuals from the Proud Boys and other extremist groups. I'd like to play a brief video highlighting some of this evidence.
My name is Marcus Childress, and I'm an investigative counsel for the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
white
like me to condemn. White supremacists and right Proud Boys.
Stand back and stand by.
After he made this comment, Enrique Terrio, then chairman of the Proud Boys, said on Parler, "Standing by, sir." During our investigation, we learned that this comment during the presidential debate actually led to an increase in membership from the Proud Boys.
Would you say that Proud Boys numbers increased after the stand back, stand by comment?
Exponentially. I'd say tripled probably, with the potential for a lot more eventually.
And did you ever sell any stand back and stand by merchandise?
One of the vendors on my page actually beat me to it, but I wish I would have made a stand back, stand by shirt.
On December 19th, President Trump tweeted about the January 6th rally and told attendees, "Be there, we'll be wild." Many of the witnesses that we interviewed were inspired by the president's call and came to D.C. for January 6th. But the extremists, they took it a step further. They viewed this tweet as a call to arms. A day later, the Department of Justice describes how the Proud Boys created a chat called the Ministry of Self-Defense Leadership Chat. In this chat, the Proud Boys established a command structure in anticipation of coming back to D.C. on January 6th. The Department of Justice describes Mr. Tarrio coming into possession of a document called the 1776 Returns, which describes individuals occupying key buildings around the United States Capitol. The Oath Keepers are another group that the committee investigated.
You better get your ass to D.C., folks, this Saturday.
Yeah, if you don't, there'll be no more Republic. But we're not going to let that happen. It's not even an if. It's either President Trump is encouraged and bolstered and strengthened to do what he must do, or we wind up in a bloody fight. We all know that. The fight's coming.
The Oath Keepers began planning to block the peaceful transfer of power shortly after the November 3rd election. And according to the Department of Justice, Stuart Rhodes, the Oath Keepers leader, said to his followers that we were not going to get through this without a civil war. In response to the December 19th, 2020 tweet by President Trump, the Oath Keepers focused on January 6th in Washington, D.C. In response to the tweet, one member, the president of the Florida chapter, put on social media, "The president called us to the Capitol. He wants us to make it wild." The goal was for the Oath Keepers to be called to duty so that they could keep the president in power, although President Trump had just lost the election. The committee learned that the Oath Keepers set up quick reaction forces outside of the city in Virginia where they stored arms. The goal of these quick reaction forces was to be on standby just in case President Trump invoked the Insurrection Act.
Did the Oath Keepers ever provide weapons to members?
I'm going to decline to answer that and put them at grounds and due process grounds.
In footage obtained by the committee, we learned that on the night of January 5th, Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes met in a parking garage in Washington, D.C.
There's mutual respect there. I think we're fighting the same fight, and I think that's what's important.
The committee learned that the Oath Keepers went into the Capitol through the east doors in two stack formations. The DOJ alleges that one of the stacks went into the Capitol looking for Speaker Pelosi, although they never found her. As the attack was unfolding, Mr. Tarrio took credit. In documents obtained by the Department of Justice, Mr. Tarrio said in an encrypted chat, "Make no mistake, and we did this." Later on that evening, Mr. Tarrio even posted a video which seemed to resemble him in front of the Capitol with a black cape. And the title of the video was Premonition. The evidence developed by the Select Committee and the Department of Justice highlights how each group participated on the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. In fact, the investigation revealed that it was individuals associated with the Proud Boys who instigated the initial breach at the Peace Circle at 12:53 p.m. Within 10 minutes, rioters had already filled the Lower West Plaza. By 2 o'clock, rioters had reached the doors on the West and the East Plazas. And by 2:13, rioters had actually broken through the Senate wing door and gotten into the Capitol building. A series of breaches followed. At 2:25 p.m., rioters breached the east side doors to the Rotunda. And then right after 2:40 p.m., rioters breached the east side doors near the Ways and Means room. Once the rioters infiltrated the Capitol, they moved through the crypt, the Rotunda, the hallways leading to the House chambers, and even inside the Senate chambers.
Individuals associated with two violent extremist groups have been charged with seditious conspiracy in connection with the January 6th attack. One is the Oath Keepers. They are a group of armed anti-government extremists. The other group is the Proud Boys. They promote white supremacist beliefs and have engaged in violence with people they view as their political enemies. Members of both groups have already pled guilty to crimes associated with the January 6th attack. Mr. Quested, as part of the documentary you've been filming, you gained access to the Proud Boys and their leader, Enrique Tarrio. Your crew filmed them in Washington, D.C. on the evening of January 5th and then on January 6th. On January 5th, the night before the attack, you were with the head of the Proud Boys, Mr. Tarrio, in Washington, D.C. What happened?
We picked up Mr. Tarrio from jail. He'd been arrested for carrying some magazines, some extra capacity magazines, and he took responsibility for the burning of the Black Lives Matter flag that was stolen from the church on December the 12th. We were attempting to get an interview with Mr. Tarrio. We had no idea of any of the events that were going to subsequently happen. We drove him to pick up his bags from the property department of the police, which is just south of the mall. We picked up his bags and went to get some other bags from the Phoenix Hotel, where we encountered Mr. Stuart Rhodes from the Oath Keepers. By the time I'd gone to park the car, my colleague was saying, who'd got into the car with Mr. Tarrio, that they had moved to a location around the corner, the parking garage of the Hall of Legends, I believe. And so we quickly drove over there. We drove down into the parking garage and filmed the scene of Mr. Tarrio and Mr. Rhodes and certain other individuals in that garage. We then continued to follow Mr. Tarrio. There was some discussion about where he was going to go. He ended up going towards a hotel in Baltimore, and we conducted an interview with him in the hotel room. And then we returned to D.C. for that night. And what was interesting that night, actually, was that was the first indication that D.C. was much more busy than it had been any other time we'd been here, because we couldn't get into the hotels we wanted to, and we ended up at a hotel that, was not as satisfactory as we would have hoped.
Thank you. So what you're saying is you filmed the meeting between Mr. Tarrio and Oath Keepers leader Stuart Rhodes, right?
Indeed.
You couldn't hear what was said, but according to the Justice Department indictment of Mr. Tarrio, a participant referenced the Capitol. Now, on the morning of January 6th, you learned the Proud Boys would gather near the rally scheduled to take place near the White House. What time did you meet up with the Proud Boys, and what was happening when they met?
We met up with the Proud Boys somewhere around 10:30 a.m. and they were starting to walk down the mall easterly direction towards the Capitol. There was a large contingent, more than I had expected, and I was confused to a certain extent why we were walking away from the president's speech, because that's what I felt we were there to cover.
So at 10:30 a.m., that's early in the day. That's even before President Trump had started speaking. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
So how many Proud Boys would you estimate were marching together to the Capitol?
A couple of hundred. Potentially, yeah, I'd say a couple of hundred Proud Boys were marching towards the Capitol at that point.
At the time, was the area heavily guarded?
No, that was, I remember we walked we walked down the mall, we walked to the right of the reflecting pool, and then north along the road that leads to the Peace Circle, And as we were walking past the peace circle, I framed the Proud Boys to the right of my shot with the Capitol behind, and we see one sole police officer at the barriers, which subsequently breached. We then walk up and past a tactical unit preparing, and you see that in the film where the man questions their duty and their honor, and you see maybe a dozen Capitol Police putting on their riot gear.
So, how would you describe the atmosphere at that time?
The atmosphere it seemed to be much darker. I make efforts to create a familiarity between myself and my subjects to make them feel comfortable. And the atmosphere was much darker this day than had been in these other days. And there was also a contingent of Proud Boys that I hadn't met before from Arizona who appeared to wear these orange hats and had orange armbands.
So when the Proud Boys went back down the hill to the Peace Circle, did a larger crowd start together?
Well, no. First of all, we went round to the back and down the steps, and we took some photographs on the east side of the Capitol, and then we went for lunch. We went for tacos.
So, Mr. Questa, you're a journalist, so you're careful to stick to things that you have observed. But what you've told us is highly relevant. Let me highlight a few key facts that you and others have provided the committee. First, there was a large group of Proud Boys present at the Capitol. We know that from multiple sources. You now estimate that there were around 250 to 300 individuals that you've testified. They weren't there for President Trump's speech. We know this because they left that area to march toward the Capitol before the speech began. They walked around the Capitol that morning. I'm concerned this allowed them to see what defenses were in place and where weaknesses might be. And they decided to launch their attack at the Peace Circle, which is the front door of the Capitol complex. It's the first security perimeter that those marching from the ellipse would have to come to as they moved toward the Capitol. The Peace Circle walkway was always where the thousands of angry Trump supporters would arrive after President Trump sent them from the ellipse. The Proud Boys timed their attack to the moments before the start of the joint session in the Capitol, which is also where President Trump directed the angry mob, quote, "We fight like hell," end quote. He told them before sending them down Pennsylvania Avenue, right to where the Proud Boys gathered and where you were filming. Now, a central question is whether the attack on the Capitol was coordinated and planned. What you witnessed is what a coordinated and planned effort would look like. It was the culmination of a months-long effort spearheaded by President Trump. Mr. Questa, thank you for your eyewitness account of the lead up to the breach of the Peace Circle. This brings us to a point in time where you and Officer Edwards were in close proximity. At this point, I reserve the balance of my time pursuant to 5C, Section 8 of House Resolution 503. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Officer Edwards, I want to start by thanking you for your service and thank you for your courage. Thank you for being here this evening. I know that it's not easy to relive what happened for you and for the officers behind you and for the family members of officers in the audience this evening. But it's really important for the country to have a full accounting and understand what happened. I want to start, Officer Edwards, with a short clip that shows the horrible moment when you were injured as the peace circle was breached. Officer Edwards, can you describe the crowd that had assembled at the Peace Circle as you and your fellow officers stood behind and guarded the bike racks at the Peace Circle?
Yes, so there were about, I want to say about 5 of us on that line. And there was our bike rack, and then at the bottom of the Pennsylvania Avenue walkway, or right by Peace Circle, there was another bike rack. And so the crowd had kind of gathered there. It was the crowd led by Joseph Biggs, and they were mostly in civilian clothes. There were some who had military fatigues on. We could see people with bulletproof vests on, things like that. They didn't seem, extremely cohesive, but they had gathered there in their outfits, but they had gathered there together, and Joseph Biggs started, he had a megaphone, and he started talking about, first it was things kind of relating to Congress, and then the tables started turning once the, what is now the Arizona group is what you said, the crowd with orange hats, they came up chanting F-U-C-K, Antifa, and they joined that group. And once they joined that group, Joseph Biggs' rhetoric turned to the Capitol Police. He started asking us questions like, you didn't miss a paycheck during the pandemic. Mentioning stuff about our pay scale was mentioned. And, started turning the tables on us. And I've worked, I can, conservatively say probably hundreds of civil disturbance events. I know when I'm being turned into a villain, and that's when I turned to my sergeant and I stated the understatement of the century. I said, Sarge, I think we're gonna need a few more people down here. And so after that, I think they started conferring. They went a little silent. They started conferring among each other. I saw the person now identified as Ryan Samsel. He put his arm around Joseph Biggs, and they were talking, and then they started approaching the first barricade. They ripped the first barricade down, and they approached our bike racks. At that time, we started holding on, grabbing the bike racks. There weren't many of us, so I grabbed the middle between 2 different bike racks. And, I wasn't under any pretense that I could hold it for very long, but I just wanted to, make sure that we could get more people down and get our CDU units time to answer the call. So we started grappling over the bike racks. I felt the bike rack come on top of my head, and I was pushed backwards, and my foot caught the stair behind me, and my chin hit the handrail, and then at that point I had blacked out, but the back of my head clipped the concrete stairs behind me. And
you were knocked unconscious, is that right, Officer Edwards?
Yes, ma'am.
but then when you regained consciousness, even with the injuries, you returned to duty. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. You know, at that time, adrenaline kicked in. I ran towards the West Front, and I tried to hold the line at the Senate steps at the Lower West Terrace. More people kept coming at us. It just seemed like, you know, more and more people started, you know, coming onto the West Front. They started overpowering us. And that was right about when MPD's officers showed up. Their bike officers pushed the crowd back and allowed our CDU units as well as theirs to form that line that you see, that very thin line between us and the protesters or the rioters, you know, at that time. I fell behind that line, and for a while I started decontaminating people who had gotten sprayed and treating people medically who needed it.
And then you were injured again there on the West Terrace. Is that right, Officer Edwards?
Yes, ma'am. So after a while, I got back on the line. It was on the house side of the Lower West Terrace. And I was holding that line for a while. There weren't many of us over there. And Officer Sicknick was behind me for most of the time, for about 30 to 45 minutes that I was down there. We were just, as the best we could, we were just, you know, grappling over bike racks and trying to hold them as quick as possible. All of a sudden, I see movement to the left of me, and I turned, and it was Officer Sicknick with his head in his hands, and he was ghostly pale, which I figured at that point that he had been sprayed, and I was concerned. My you know, cop alarm bells went off, because if you get sprayed with pepper spray, you're going to turn red. He turned just about as pale as this sheet of paper. And so I looked back to see what had hit him, what had happened, and that's when I got sprayed in the eyes as well. I was taken to be decontaminated by another officer, but we didn't get the chance because we were then tear gassed.
And we are going to play just a brief clip of that moment that you've just described, Officer Edwards. Officer Edwards, I just want to thank you for being here. And I know, again, how difficult it is. I know the family of Officer Sicknick as well, who's here tonight. One of the things one of the Capitol Police officers said to me recently was to ask me whether or not, as members of Congress, all of us understood that on that day, on January 6th, when we were evacuated from the chamber, were led to a safe, undisclosed location, whether we knew that so many of you had rushed out of the building and into the fight. And I can assure you that we do know that, and that we understand how important your service is. Thank you for your continued work with our committee and the interviews, and thank you very much for both of you for being here this evening. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Edwards, can you give us one memory of that awful day that stands out most vividly in your mind?
I can. That time when I talked about falling behind MPD's line, I remember because I had been kind of shielded away because I was holding those stairs, so I wasn't able to really see what was going on over here. When I fell behind that line and I saw, I can just remember my breath catching in my throat because what I saw was just a war scene. It was something like I had seen out of the movies. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were officers on the ground, you know, they were bleeding, they were throwing up, they were, you know, they had, I mean, I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood. You know, I was catching people as they fell. You know, it was carnage. It was chaos. I can't even describe what I saw. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that as a police officer, as a law enforcement officer, I would find myself in the middle of a battle. You know, I'm trained to detain, you know, a couple of subjects and handle a crowd, but I'm not combat trained. And that day, it was just hours of hand-to-hand combat, hours of dealing with things that were way beyond any law enforcement officer has ever trained for. And I just remember that moment of stepping behind the line and just seeing the absolute war zone that the West Front had become.
Let me thank you for your service and obviously your bravery that you have told the world about tonight. It's unfortunate that you had to defend the Capitol from fellow Americans. None of us would ever think that that would have to happen, but it did. So let me thank our witnesses for joining us tonight and sharing their experiences with America. Throughout my chairmanship of this committee, I've continuously vowed that this committee will ensure a comprehensive account of the heroic acts on January 6th, and that we will follow the facts wherever they lead. Your testimony is an essential part of that record and helps us do our job. Mr. Quested, thank you for sharing your footage and your account of the day's events with us. The images you recorded and have shared with the committee do a better job than any of our words in reinforcing the violence of January 6th. We hope that the power of your footage help encourage all Americans to consider how citizens with so much in common could viciously brawl at the seat of their democratic government. Officer Edwards, thank you for your brave service, as I indicated, on January 6th, and all you did to protect us, and most importantly, our democracy. If you and your fellow officers hadn't held the line against those violent insurrectionists, we can only imagine the disaster that would have ensued. Your heroism in the face of danger is admirable, and your will to continue to protect and serve despite your serious injuries should be an inspiration to all of us. We wish you a continued recovery and look forward to seeing you back in uniform sometime soon. The members of the Select Committee may have additional questions for tonight's witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objections, members will be permitted 10 business days to submit statements for the record, including opening remarks and additional questions for the witnesses. The witnesses have just told us what they heard the rioters saying while they stormed the Capitol on that day. Now we're going to hear it from the rioters themselves. Without objection, I include in the record a video presentation.
What really made me want to come was the fact that, I had supported Trump all that time. I did believe, that the election was being stolen, and Trump asked us to come.
He personally asked for us to come to D.C. that day. And I thought, for everything he's done for us, if this is the only thing he's going to ask of me, I'll do it.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Did you recall President Trump mentioning going to the Capitol during his speech?
Oh, yeah. So that's one of my disappointments. He said he was going to go with us, that he was going to be there.
I know why I was there, and that's because he called me there, and he laid out what is happening in our government. He laid it out.
But I remember Donald Trump telling people to be there, right? I mean, to support.
So you mentioned that the president asked you. Do you remember a specific message?
Basically, yeah, he asked for us to come to D.C., that big things are going to happen.
What got me interested, he said, I have something very important to say on January 6th or something like that, is what got me interested to be there.
Trump has only asked me for two things. He asked me for my vote, and he asked me to come on January 6th.
When the committee reconvenes next week, we're going to examine the lies that convinced those men and others to storm the Capitol, to try to stop the transfer of power. We're going to take a close look at the first part of Trump's attack on the rule of law, when he hit the fuse that ultimately resulted in the violence of January 6th. Without objection, and with that, the committee stands adjourned.
Watching ABC News Live coverage, the first primetime hearing, the findings from the House Select Committee into what played into the January 6th attack, what happened leading up to it in the days that followed, and of course, that 24-hour period. I want to bring in Donna Brazil, ABC News political contributor, of course, Democratic strategist. Donna, did the committee accomplish what it set out to do tonight?
I thought so. It was a very compelling way to bring all of this information, the evidence, the video, the remarks from former Bill Barr and Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner. Sadly, the attack that took place on January 6th is still ongoing. It's ongoing in many ways, attacking on our election system itself. But personally, as a Hill resident for over 30 years, as a former Hill staffer, to listen to what happened and to hear the testimony of that brave officer, it just makes me sad all over again.
Donna, thank you. Governor Christie, you heard Donna bring up Officer Carolyn Edwards. She talked about the battle, the war zone that was the west front of the Capitol. Was it effective? Did it land for the American people tonight?
Well, we'll see, David, how the American people react to it. But I think the most important thing for the long-term credibility of telling the story tonight was using the words of the people around the president. As Donna said, Attorney General Barr, Ivanka Trump herself, also the people around the campaign, telling him right from the beginning things that I was telling him at the same time. There's no evidence of fraud. There's no evidence that this election was stolen. And I think, it's one thing to hear it for Republicans, to hear it from Democrats, but to hear it not only from Republicans, but from the people who ran the president's campaign, the people closest to him in the White House and his own family. I think that makes it much, much more powerful for Republicans and Republican-leaning independents to hear those things, David. And so we'll see what goes on from here. but those are some very powerful words from people who were part of the Trump administration.
Governor Christie with us tonight as well. Governor, thank you as always. Martha Raddatz live in the Capitol tonight. You were there as this unfolded that day. And Martha, they're trying to make the case that this was coordinated, this was planned. They talked about the Proud Boys actually being closer to the Capitol even before the president began the speech that morning, speaking to the coordination. Whether or not they made that case effectively or not will be up for Americans watching to decide. But you were there that day as this very scene unfolded.
I sure was, David, and I saw coordination. I saw the Oath Keepers in particular standing very close to me here at the Capitol. They had walkie-talkies, they had body armor on, they had helmets on. Some of them even had dogs. So there was clearly some sort of coordination with those walkie-talkies, and they were dressed for battle. You heard the officers say she wasn't combat trained. They were ready for battle. And many of the people up here on that day, more than 100, were veterans, David.
Martha Raddatz there that day and back there tonight for us. John Carl, you were in the hearing room for a time. What did you make of what you witnessed?
Well, I thought that really the powerful moment, I mean, there were many of them, but to hear Bill Barr say in such blunt terms that there was nothing to the allegations of fraud in the election, that he had directly told that to President Trump, and then to hear Ivanka Trump say that she respects Bill Barr and that she accepted what he had to say, I think a very powerful moment.
Pierre Thomas, you cover justice. And you know Bill Barr, you've interviewed him several times, extremely loyal to President Trump, and in the end, he was the one who told him there is no evidence here of widespread fraud.
David, I've spoken to former AG Barr, and he was blunt with the president. There was no fraud. He actually had looked for fraud. He had looked for it. He found none, and then we learned tonight that the president still pushed Barr's predecessor to pursue what was a lie, David.
Pierre Thomas with us as well. Thank you, Pierre. Rachel Scott, who covers Congress. Of course, Rachel, we know Republicans privately, in the hours publicly after January 6th, speaking out against what they saw. Now, nearly a year into this investigation, not doing so as much publicly. You're getting reaction tonight from members in the House?
Yes, and David, Republican leaders were asked earlier if they'd be watching today's hearing. Only one raised their hand at that press conference, but Republicans, including Republican Lisa Stefanik, who replaced Liz Cheney in leadership, calling this all a sham, considering it a distraction, David.
Rachel Scott, live at her post on the Hill. As always, Rachel, our thanks to you and to our entire team tonight, and of course, thanks to you at home. The next hearing takes place Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern. Our team will be there. I'm David Muir, New York. I'll see you tomorrow night. Good night.
Heaven isn't just a promise.